Hey, what's up you guys? My name is Tyler Rugge. Welcome back to my YouTube channel. So, I wanted to give you guys an update on my Bearded Dragon's Bioactive setup since I've had it for about a month now. So I just wanted to go over some concerns that you guys have voiced to me and also concerns that I had initially going into it, because I mentioned this before, but this was quite experimental for me. I really just wanted to know how a bioactive bearded dragon setup would work, because not a ton of people have done it. And as you probably know if you watch me, you know that I love bioactive setups because they're super naturalistic, and I just think they create really natural environments for reptiles and other animals. And I wanted to try going bioactive with my bearded dragon just to see how it would work and if it would work. So I just wanted to go over everything. But before we get into it, I will say that overall, so far, I do really like the bioactive setup. I haven't run into really any issues that I thought I would run into. So let's get straight into some of the concerns that I had going into it, and some of you guys have also voiced to me. Probably the very first thing I want to discuss is loose substrate. Because yes, my bearded dragon is on loose substrate, and it's a very touchy subject in the bearded dragon keeping community. People are very divided on this debate of whether or not loose substrate is okay for bearded dragons. There's people who hate all loose substrate, there's people who only keep their bearded dragons on loose substrate, and there's also people in between that are, okay with some things and not other things. Talking about this subject could be its own video, and it probably will be at some point, but I just wanted to touch on it. A lot of the time on my channel in the past, I have not recommended loose substrate for bearded dragons, and the reason for this is mostly because a lot of people who aren't very experienced in reptile care come to my channel for advice, and I wouldn't really want to recommend a loose substrate for someone who has never taken care of a bearded dragon before, just because I think there's some background knowledge you need to have. Most loose substrates that are marketed for reptiles aren't good for bearded dragons. Forest floor bedding, wouldn't use it. Eco Earth, wouldn't use it. Calcium sand, which I see so many people use for their bearded dragons, I absolutely hate it. If you're an experienced bearded dragon owner and you have a lot of experience with using loose substrate and a lot of success with it, then that's fantastic. However, I just don't feel comfortable always recommending it to someone who has never owned a bearded dragon before, because I would hate to say, yes, loose substrate is great, and then they go out and get calcium sand or like coconut fiber for their bearded dragon. So again, I don't want to start a huge debate in the comments, but I personally don't hate loose substrate for bearded dragon if you do it properly. For my bearded dragon setup, I used the BioDudes substrate. I used the BioDudes Arid Bioactive substrate. In my opinion, it's completely safe for bearded dragons. Alternatively, if you want to create your own mixture for bearded dragons, a lot of people like to do a mixture of like play sand and organic soil amongst other things, and I think that that's fine. I personally just really don't like keeping bearded dragons on just sand. I don't think play sand or calcium sand very accurately recreates their environment in the wild. And I understand that a lot of the places they live on in the wild is sandy, but it's not just like loose sand everywhere, if that makes sense. Obviously, with any loose substrate, if your bearded dragon is like eating mouthfuls of it, it's probably not going to be good. But in most cases, that's not going to happen. Since I've never kept my bearded dragon on loose substrate before, I was really interested to see how he would react to it and how he would interact with his environment differently. And overall, he's been a lot more active and alert in his new setup. I think he definitely has a lot more like stimulation in there. But one thing to keep in mind is that he is never on the ground. So since he's usually up high, climbing on all these pieces of wood and everything, he just doesn't spend a lot of time on the substrate, so him ingesting it isn't a huge concern for me. I haven't had any issues with my bearded dragon even attempting to eat the substrate, and I also don't feed him on the ground. I usually put roaches kind of like in front of him on the pieces of wood that he's on, or I'll feed him like a couple superworms in a little dish, and I also tongue feed him his greens because he doesn't really eat greens unless I tongue feed them to him. And with that being said, if you use a good substrate, your bearded dragon won't have any issues passing it if they're being kept correctly. There's a lot higher risk of impaction if your temperatures aren't high enough, but if your temperatures are good and they ingest a little bit of substrate here and there, they're gonna pass it without an issue. I think a lot of people have had issues in the past with their bearded dragon getting impacted on things like calcium sand, and then it made people not want to use any loose substrate at all. Obviously, I think not using a loose substrate is a much safer option, but I think if you do your research and you kind of know what you're doing and what precautions to take when you're using it, then I think that it can work perfectly fine. But if you don't like loose substrate, then don't use it. It's simple as that. But for the sake of having a bioactive setup, I had to use loose substrate, and I wanted to see how he would like it. He seems pretty indifferent about having substrate. I know some bearded dragons love to dig, but Malachi has not dug in his substrate at all. I think I've talked about substrate long enough. Again, I can do a whole video just discussing that one. Moving on, the next biggest concern that I think a lot of people had for this setup was humidity. Because I have live plants in here, it does need to be watered every once in a while to keep some moisture in the substrate. And also, there are some people saying that they thought the humidity would be way too high for a bearded dragon. There were also people saying that they thought the substrate would be too dry for any cleanup crew to actually survive in it. I explained this in my last video, but I'll explain it again. The substrate that I got from the Biodude is made with really good drainage. So when you water it, the moisture is going to kind of settle towards the bottom and the top layer is going to dry out, whereas the bottom layer is going to still be a little bit moist. So cleanup crew tends to live not right on top of the substrate, but they're gonna dig down to where it's more moist, and that's where they're going to live and reproduce. So the bottom layers of the substrate has moisture for isopods and whatever other cleanup crew I might add. Now, humidity being way too high for me is not an issue. This can kind of be dependent on where you live, because if you live somewhere where it's naturally more humid, you might run into more issues with not being able to keep it as dry. But where I live, my house doesn't stay super humid, so I don't have trouble keeping the humidity low. Now, when I water his enclosure, the humidity does spike temporarily, but it doesn't get super high because he's kept in an enclosure with a screen top and it has good ventilation. So it just does not hold humidity very well at all. And the heat lamp also helps dry out the enclosure a ton. So if I look at the gauge right now, it says that the humidity is at 41%, and I watered his enclosure a couple days ago, and 40% is actually a really good humidity for bearded dragons. Now, of course, right after watering it, the humidity is going to spike, and it usually spikes up to about 50%, which still isn't terrible for bearded dragons. And if I water his enclosure in the morning, it'll spike immediately, but by the end of the day, it already starts to decline. And then by the next day, it's usually back down into the 40s. It's not very humid. And having humidity spikes every once in a while isn't a bad thing because it happens in the wild as well. In Australia, where bearded dragons live, it doesn't stay 30% humidity all the time. The humidity there can range from anywhere from the 30s to up to the 60s. It's very natural for them to have spikes in the humidity, and as long as you're not keeping the humidity super high all the time, you're not going to run into issues. But overall, the humidity typically stays between around 32 to like 45%, so it's really not a bad range for a bearded dragon. One thing that I was concerned about too was keeping all these plants alive. I have a cactus in there, which, by the way, there aren't any spiky things on the cactus. I got some comments of people saying, oh my god, your bearded dragon's gonna like cut himself and hurt himself on the cactus or on the succulents, which I don't know, I thought was kind of ridiculous, but there's no spikies on like any of the plants in there. But I was worried I wouldn't be able to keep the plants alive because whenever I've tried to keep a cactus alive in the past, it hasn't gone too well for me. So that's one thing I was nervous about. Things like succulents and cacti, I'm really bad at. And I think I have like a grow light LED thing from the Biodude that's supposed to help with giving the plants a good exposure and spectrum of light. And I think that helped a ton. Also, I just need to make sure not to water it too much, but the plants have been doing well so far, so I'm pretty happy about that too. And again, overall, I haven't noticed any negative things about this so far. I've only experienced positives, and the main difference I've noticed is that, one, Malachi is a lot more active and alert. So I've noticed that he just acts a lot more alert, and he just seems a lot happier in there. Aside from that, the maintenance of this is a lot easier because when I had Malachi on tiles, he would always poop on the tiles and then smear it all over the place and get his poop all over himself in his enclosure. And it was a real pain to clean that up. And now with this Bioactive setup, you know, he poops, he manages to not smear it all over the place and get it all over himself, and the cleanup crew takes care of it for me, which is wonderful. I guess bottom line, would I recommend a Bioactive setup? If you are confident going into it and you have experience with bearded dragon keeping, I would definitely recommend it. If you're a beginner who's just getting a bearded dragon, I probably wouldn't recommend jumping straight into getting a Bioactive setup, especially because I think my experience with owning bearded dragons, as well as my past experiences with keeping other Bioactive setups, has helped me tremendously with being able to create it and make it sustain itself. But it might be a little bit more difficult if you don't have as much experience with it. So just make sure you do a lot of research first, of course, but if you feel confident going into doing a Bioactive setup, I would highly recommend it. For me, it worked out really well. If you guys have any questions or other things you would like me to talk about, feel free to leave them in the comments below. But yeah, that's it for today's video. If you guys liked it, give it a thumbs up, subscribe. I post videos every week. Check out my social media and my vlog channel. Those will be linked down in the description below. I'll see you guys in my next video. Say goodbye to Malachi. Malachi, can you say goodbye? Okay.